My name is Daniel Harper. I am writing this as a record, not a confession, and certainly not as a story meant to entertain. I am a search and rescue volunteer with 8 years of field experience, and I have been hiking and backpacking since I was old enough to carry my own water. What follows began as a routine recovery task and turned into the most disturbing day of my life, one that has left me questioning the boundaries between observation, documentation, and survival. The call came in just after sunrise. A solo backpacker had failed to check out at a remote trailhead after a planned overnight route through a section of protected wilderness, rarely used outside of peak season. Weather conditions were stable. No storm systems, no wildfire activity. The situation did not immediately raise alarms, but protocol required a ground sweep. I volunteered to take the eastern spur alone, a decision I would regret before the day was over. By mid-morning, I was 4 miles in. The trail was narrow but clearly marked, winding through dense pine and uneven terrain. There were no signs of struggle, no broken branches, no discarded gear. At first, everything felt ordinary, almost comforting in its predictability. The forest was quiet in the way remote places often are, not silent but subdued. Wind in the canopy. Insects moving through dry leaves. My own breathing, steady and familiar. I found the backpack just before noon. It was resting upright against a fallen log, positioned deliberately rather than dropped. A standard internal frame pack, weathered but intact with no visible damage. The rain cover was folded neatly into its side pocket. The straps were loosened, as if the owner had set it down with the intention picking it up again shortly. That detail struck me as odd. Experienced hikers do not abandon packs without reason. I performed a quick perimeter check. No footprints leading away. No scuff marks. The ground was dry enough that any recent movement should have left a trace. There was nothing. Inside the top compartment, I found basic supplies: water filter, spare socks, food rations. Everything accounted for. No blood, no torn fabric, no signs of panic. Then, in the inner sleeve usually reserved for maps, I found a small, weather-resistant notebook sealed inside a zip bag. It was a backpacking log. The first page listed the owner's name, written carefully in block letters, Evan Miller. Below that, emergency contact information, route details, and a planned return time. Everything about it suggested discipline and experience. The handwriting was steady, controlled. This was not someone prone to carelessness. I sat on the fallen log and began to read, intending only to confirm timelines before calling in the find. The initial entries were mundane, even soothing in their familiarity. Time stamps, distance covered, notes on terrain and weather, observations about wildlife, mentions of light fatigue, good visibility, no issues. Around midday, the tone subtly shifted. Evan wrote about hearing something off the trail. Not an animal he could identify. The description was cautious, not alarmist. He noted that it moved parallel to him for several minutes before stopping. He assumed it was another hiker and even wrote that he considered calling out, but decided against it due to visibility and etiquette. The next entry was less certain. He wrote about the same sound returning later, closer this time. Still no visual confirmation. He made a note to remain aware but continued forward. By early afternoon, the handwriting changed. The letters grew slightly uneven, as if written quickly or under tension. Evan described feeling watched. Not followed, not hunted, but observed. He emphasized that there were still no physical signs. No snap branches. No footsteps. Just the sensation, persistent and intrusive, that he was no longer alone in the way wilderness, solitude is supposed to feel. I remember glancing up from the page at that point. The forest around me felt unchanged, yet subtly wrong. The wind had died. The insects were gone. The quiet was no longer passive. It pressed in, heavy and deliberate. I should have stopped reading. I should have called it in immediately and waited for backup. Instead, I kept going, driven by a professional instinct to understand context, to reconstruct the subject's mindset. The entries became more fragmented as the day progressed. Evan wrote about altering his route, slightly to avoid what he described as areas where the air feels wrong. He noted that his compass was functioning normally, his GPS intact, yet his sense of direction felt unreliable. He described moments where the trail ahead seemed longer than it should be, stretching subtly, as if the distance itself was being manipulated. There were no mentions of hallucinations, no signs of dehydration or injury. His observations were precise, grounded, almost clinical. That made them far more unsettling. The final entry on that page ended abruptly mid-sentence. I turned the page. The handwriting was barely recognizable now. The letters slanted sharply, ink pressed hard into the paper. Evan wrote that he could hear breathing nearby, slow and controlled, but not synchronized with his own. He stated, clearly and without embellishment, that whatever was near him did not move when he stopped. It adjusted instead, as if maintaining an optimal distance. That was when my radio crackled to life, startling me so badly I dropped the notebook. Dispatch asked for a status update. I told them I had located the missing backpack and a personal log belonging to the subject. I did not mention the contents. I requested permission to remain on site for further assessment. They agreed. Unaware of how tightly my hands were shaking as I picked the notebook back up, I checked my watch. It was still the same day Evan had written about. The time stamps aligned perfectly with the current hour. And according to the log, whatever he was running from was still somewhere in this forest, waiting for him to move again. I stayed where I was longer than I should have. Protocol says to secure found property, mark coordinates, and withdraw if no immediate danger is present. Protocol also assumes the environment behaves in predictable ways. After reading Evan Miller's log, predictability no longer felt like something I could rely on. I forced myself to stand, rolled my shoulders, and took a slow look around. Nothing had changed visually. Trees stood where they should. Light filtered down through the canopy at a reasonable angle for early afternoon. Yet the sense of being evaluated, measured somehow, had intensified. It wasn't fear yet. It was vigilance, the kind that tightens your chest without triggering panic. I packed Evan's notebook into my own dry pouch and secured his backpack to a tree, marking it with high visibility tape for retrieval. I radioed dispatch again, reported my intent to continue a controlled sweep along Evan's planned route, and stated clearly that I would update every 30 minutes. They acknowledged. Their voices sounded distant, like they were speaking from another environment entirely. As I moved forward, I paid closer attention to my surroundings than I ever had before. Every sound felt loaded. Every shift in light seemed intentional. The trail narrowed slightly, winding downhill into a shaded corridor, where the trees grew closer together. My GPS showed steady progress, yet my internal sense of distance felt distorted. 10 minutes of walking felt like half an hour. Then, abruptly, the opposite happened. I would check my watch and realize time had passed far faster than it should have. I stopped walking. The forest stopped with me. Not metaphorically. Literally. The ambient noise cut out so cleanly it felt edited. No wind. No insects. Even my own gear seemed muted. I stood still for a full minute, testing the moment. My breathing sounded too loud in my ears. I became acutely aware of how exposed I was on the trail, framed by trees that offered cover to anything watching from deeper in the woods. Then, somewhere off to my left, something shifted. It wasn't a footstep. There was no crunch of leaves or snap of twigs. It was the sound of displacement, like mass adjusting its position without touching the ground. The sensation crawled up my spine, sharp and unmistakable. Whatever Evan had been describing, I was no longer just reading about it. I resumed walking immediately. The sound returned, matching my pace without rhythm. When I slow, it slowed. When I stopped again, it did not approach. It simply adjusted, maintaining that same vague proximity. I never saw it, not once. My peripheral vision caught movement that vanished when I turned my head. Shadows where shadows should not fall. Gaps between trees that felt deeper than they looked. I reached a small clearing by mid-afternoon, one marked on Evan's log as a rest point. The ground was disturbed there, not violently. No signs of struggle. Just compressed earth, where someone had stood for a long time, shifting weight back and forth. Evan had written about stopping here to listen. I took out the notebook again, hands steady now, focused. Fear had settled into something colder and more functional. The next entries were dated only minutes apart, yet the content suggested hours of psychological erosion. Evan wrote about realizing the sounds were not following him from behind. They were repositioning ahead of him, anticipating his path. He noted that whenever he attempted to alter his route, the forest seemed to resist. Trails narrowed. Underbrush thickened unnaturally fast. Clearings became choked corridors. He emphasized repeatedly that he never saw anything physically impossible. No sudden appearances. No unnatural speed. Just presence, always just out of view, behaving with patience. One entry stood out. He wrote that the entity, whatever it was, never crossed open space. It stayed within tree cover. It respected certain boundaries. That suggested intention, not instinct. I scanned the clearing instinctively, noting how exposed it was compared to the surrounding woods. The tree line formed a near perfect ring round the open ground. I stepped into the center and waited. Nothing happened. The silence persisted, thick and watchful, but the pressure eased slightly. Evan had been right. Open ground mattered. That realization brought a thin thread of control back into my thoughts. I moved quickly after that, aiming for the next marked waypoint, a ridge overlooked less than a mile ahead. According to Evan's log, that was where things escalated. As I climbed, the forest began to feel compressed, as if the squeeze between trees was shrinking incrementally. My shoulders brushed branches I was certain had not been that close moments earlier. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to scan too widely, aware that panic often begins when the mind tries to track too many threats at once. The sound returned halfway up the ridge. Closer now. I could hear the subtle rise and fall of it, deliberate and controlled. Breathing, but not labored. Not rushed. It was the breathing of something conserving energy. I reached the overlook just as the light began to fade, earlier than it should have given the time of year. The view should have opened into a wide valley. Instead, mist hung low, obscuring distance and swallowing sound. I stepped onto exposed rock and felt the pressure lift again. I checked my watch. Less than 3 hours had passed since I found the backpack. Evan's next entry described nightfall. My radio crackled again. Dispatch asked for my update. I reported my position, mentioned unusual environmental conditions without elaboration, and requested confirmation of sunset time. They responded with a time nearly 2 hours, later than what the light suggested. As the transmission ended, I realized something else Evan had written. He said the forest did not want him to leave during daylight. Standing on that ridge, watching shadows stretch unnaturally fast across the valley, I understood exactly what he meant. The light continued to fail at an unnatural rate. It wasn't a sudden drop into darkness, but a steady, deliberate dimming, as if the forest itself were slowly closing an aperture. Shadows stretched longer than they should have, bleeding together until individual trees lost their edges. The mist in the valley below thickened, swallowing depth perception and muting what little sound remained. I stayed on the exposed rock longer than was comfortable, unwilling to step back beneath the canopy. Evan's log had made one thing clear: tree cover favored whatever was moving out there. Open ground was not safety, but it was leverage. I pulled out the notebook again. The next section was written in shorter lines, almost bullet points, as if Evan was rationing both time and mental energy. He noted that dusk arrived too early, exactly as I was experiencing now. He wrote that once the light began to fade, the entity's behavior changed. It no longer repositioned ahead of him. It waited. That word was underlined twice. I felt the waiting now. Not as pressure, but as restraint. Like a held breath in the forest itself. I scanned the tree line carefully, keeping my body oriented toward the open valley. My peripheral vision caught movement again. But this time it lingered, just long enough to register shape without detail. A vertical distortion among the trunks, darker than shadow, lighter than silhouette. It did not advance. I checked my radio. Full battery. Strong signal. I called dispatch and requested an immediate extraction plan, citing environmental disorientation and a potential psychological stressor related to the missing subject's log. I kept my voice even, professional, measured. They acknowledged and said a coordination team would be notified, but extraction before morning would be difficult due to terrain and fading light. Morning felt like a concept that belonged to another place. As full twilight settled in, the temperature dropped sharply. I adjusted my layers and prepared for a controlled descent back toward the trailhead, staying as much in open terrain as the landscape allowed. According to Evan's notes, this was where he made his biggest mistake. He tried to outrun the night. The log described how movement triggered proximity. The faster he went, the closer it stayed. Not chasing, just compressing the distance between them with unsettling efficiency. He wrote that slowing down did not make it retreat. It simply preserved position, conserving energy. I chose a different approach. I moved deliberately, maintaining a steady pace, stopping frequently in clearings and exposed rock patches. Each time I stopped, the forest fell silent again, that unnatural stillness pressing in like a held judgment. Each time I moved, the subtle sound returned, always just outside of clear localization. At one point, the trail dipped sharply into a narrow corridor where the canopy closed overhead. I hesitated at the threshold, heart rate climbing, despite my efforts to stay calm. Evan's next entry was written there, or somewhere very much like it. He described hearing his own footsteps echo incorrectly, too many beats. A half-second delay that suggested overlap rather than reflection. He wrote that he realized then that the breathing he'd been hearing wasn't just nearby. It was synchronized to him, offset slightly, like a shadow attempting to learn his rhythm. I entered the corridor anyway. The darkness under the trees was immediate and oppressive. My headlamp cut a narrow tunnel through the gloom, illuminating bark textures and suspended particles in the air. The forest smelled different here. Damp, metallic, almost sterile, like rain-soaked stone. The sound returned almost instantly, closer than before. I could hear the subtle intake, the controlled exhale, steady and patient. I stopped. The breathing stopped with me. Not faded, not muffled. It stopped as cleanly as if a switch had been flipped. I stood there, light fixed ahead, muscles locked, listening so intently my ears rang. Seconds stretched. I became aware of my own pulse, loud and uneven. Then, just beyond the reach of my headlamp, something shifted sideways. It did not step forward. It repositioned. The realization landed heavily. Avon had written about this moment too. He said it never closed distance directly. It reduced options. Corridors narrowed. Open ground vanished. Paths collapsed into inevitability. I backed out of the corridor slowly, refusing to turn my back, maintaining my light on the space ahead. The sound followed, but did not advance. When I reached the edge of the trees again, the pressure eased slightly, as if a boundary had been respected. I retreated uphill toward the ridge, abandoning any thought of efficient navigation. Survival had become a matter of leverage, not speed. At the ridge, full night had settled. The valley below was completely obscured now, mist reflecting faint starlight into a pale, depthless void. I sat on the rock, back against stone, and forced myself to breathe evenly. Evan's final entries were here. The handwriting deteriorated further, lines slanted and cramped. He wrote about exhaustion, about realizing that whatever was observing him was not interested in immediate harm. It was studying behavior, learning responses, testing thresholds. One line was written larger than the rest. It does not need me to run. The last paragraph ended mid-thought, ink trailing off the page as if the pen had been pulled away or dropped. There was no sign-off, no final plea. Just an abrupt silence that felt louder than anything else in the log. I sat there for a long time after finishing it, listening to the forest breathe around me, careful not to move more than necessary. My radio remained silent. No updates. No check-ins. When I attempted to transmit again, I received only static. Sometime later, without warning, the sound stopped completely. Not just the breathing. Everything. The forest did not feel relieved or relaxed. It felt finished. I did not wait to understand what that meant. I moved. Not quickly. Not slowly. With intention. Staying in open ground whenever possible, choosing discomfort over vulnerability. Trusting Evan's observations as if they were a map written in fear. Hours later, the sky began to lighten in a way that felt real this time. Birds returned cautiously. Wind stirred leaves. The forest resumed the illusion of normalcy. I emerged at the trailhead just after dawn. Search teams found no trace of Evan Miller, beyond the backpack and log I recovered. Officially, the case remains unresolved. I keep the notebook locked away. I do not reread it often, but sometimes when I stand still for too long in quiet places, I find myself listening for breathing that isn't mine and wondering whether what waited for Evan simply learned enough to let me go. Morning did not bring relief the way it should have. The light returned, but it felt thin, almost performative, like a surface layer laid over something unfinished. I stood at the trailhead longer than necessary, hands resting on my knees, catching my breath, while pretending this was just physical exhaustion. My legs trembled slightly, not from distance walked, but from the sustained tension of staying alert for so many hours without release. When my radio finally crackled back to life, it was almost jarring. Dispatch asked for confirmation of my status. I answered immediately, reporting my safe exit, the recovery of the backpack and log, and my intent to remain at the trailhead until relieved. I did not mention the breathing. I did not mention the way the forest had gone completely still before letting me leave. Those details felt impossible to communicate without sounding unhinged. 2 vehicles arrived within the hour. A field supervisor and another volunteer stepped out, their expressions shifting subtly when they saw my face. I must have looked worse than I felt. Rigid, too focused. They asked routine questions while unloading gear. But I could tell they were already recalibrating their understanding of the situation. I handed over Evan Miller's backpack first, then the notebook. The supervisor flipped through the initial pages, nodding absently at the standard entries. Distance logs, weather notes, wildlife sightings. He paused when the handwriting began to change, his brow furrowed. He read silently for several minutes before closing it carefully and slipping it into a sealed evidence bag. We began a daylight sweep together, retracing my route from the previous afternoon. With 3 people moving, the forest felt different. Not safer, exactly, but less oppressive. Sound returned fully. Birds moved between branches. Wind shifted needles underfoot. The environment behaved as expected, which only made the absence of any trace more disturbing. There were no footprints where Evan had described standing for hours. No disturbed ground in the narrow corridor where his writing had deteriorated. No signs of forced movement or injury. It was as if his physical presence had simply stopped contributing evidence beyond a certain point. The supervisor asked me to walk them through my experience, carefully and methodically. I complied, sticking to observations rather than interpretations. I described the silence, the distortion of time, the proximity sounds without visible source. I framed everything as sensory anomalies under stress, the kind that can occur in isolation environments. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said something that unsettled me more than disbelief would have. "You're not the first one to describe it this way." He didn't elaborate. By late morning, additional teams arrived. The search expanded outward, systematic and thorough. Helicopter support scanned the valley once the mist fully cleared, revealing nothing but unbroken forest. No movement, no signal pings. No abandoned shelters or off-road campsites. Evan Miller had simply ceased to exist within a definable perimeter. We regrouped near noon. The official assessment leaned toward disorientation, followed by a fatal accident, possibly involving terrain hazards beyond the established trail network. Exposure was listed as a contributing factor. The log was categorized as a psychological artifact, reflective of stress-induced paranoia during isolation. It was a neat explanation, a comfortable one. I signed my statements and complied with all debriefing requirements. On paper, everything aligned with standard wilderness incident outcomes. It wasn't until I was alone again, sitting in my vehicle with the engine idling, that the weight of the day finally settled fully into my body. My hands began to shake uncontrollably, not from fear, but from the delayed release of restraint. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and forced myself to breathe. That was when I noticed the time. According to my dashboard clock, it was just after noon. Less than 24 hours had passed since Evan Miller had begun his hike. Less than 12 since I had found his backpack. The entire escalation, his descent from routine observations to desperate documentation, had occurred within a single day. That detail gnawed at me. Whatever had been studying him had done so efficiently, purposefully, without urgency. As I prepared to leave, the supervisor approached my vehicle. He told me the log would be archived, restricted from public release pending review. He advised me to take time off, citing the psychological strain of solo recovery operations. His tone was professional, but there was something unspoken beneath it. Before he stepped away, he said one more thing. People think the danger out there is what you can see. Animals. Terrain. But every once in a while, someone runs into something that doesn't behave like a threat. It behaves like a process. I asked him what he meant. He shook his head slightly. Nothing you need to worry about. You did everything right. I drove home in silence. That night, long after I should have been asleep, I found myself replaying Evan's final words in my head. Not the fear, not the desperation, the realization, the clarity that came too late. It does not need me to run. What troubled me most was not the idea that something had followed him. It was the implication that it had learned from him. And that by reading his log, by walking his route, by responding differently, I might have taught it something new. I have not volunteered for solo recovery assignments since that day. I avoid deep forest hikes unless absolutely necessary. I do not stand still for long periods in quiet places. Because sometimes, when the world goes unnaturally silent, I feel that same restrained attention settle in, patient and familiar, as if waiting to see what I will do next. And I know, with a certainty that still tightens my chest, that Evan Miller's log did not end because the observer lost interest. It ended because it learned enough. The days that followed blurred together in a way that felt unnatural, as if time itself had lost its usual texture. I returned to routine tasks, paperwork, coordination meetings, equipment checks, but everything carried a thin layer of unreality. Conversations felt scripted. Laughter sounded misplaced. The world had resumed its normal rhythm. Yet I moved through it with the persistent sensation that I had stepped slightly out of alignment. I took the recommended time off, though rest was a misleading term. Sleep came in fragments. When I closed my eyes, I didn't see the forest. I heard it. That held silence. That deliberate restraint. I would wake abruptly, heart racing, convinced I had been standing still for too long, even though I was lying in bed. On the third day, I returned to the station to finalize documentation related to Evan Miller's case. The building was quiet, most of the team out on assignments. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The familiar smell of paper, dust, and disinfectant grounded me. Briefly, I reminded myself that I was safe, that what I had experienced was contained to a specific environment, a specific context. I was wrong. The log had been sealed and cataloged, but administrative protocol required a secondary review for archival indexing. I was asked to verify timestamps and route annotations for consistency. The notebook was placed on the table between us, its cover still marked with dirt smudges that no amount of handling had removed. I hesitated before opening it again. Reading it a second time was different. The emotional escalation stood out less than the structure. Evan's observations followed a pattern: initial awareness, environmental inconsistency, behavioral testing by the unseen presence, adjustment, learning when viewed clinically. The progression resembled a study rather than a breakdown. I pointed this out carefully, framing it as an analytical observation rather than speculation. The administrator listening to me nodded, but avoided meeting my eyes. When I asked whether similar logs had been recovered in the past, she paused longer than necessary before answering. "Not often," she said, "and not usually intact." That was the end of the conversation. I left the station unsettled, the weight of implication heavier than anything I had felt in the forest. The idea that Evan's experience was not unique, that it fit into an unspoken category rather than anomaly, reframed everything. It suggested a pattern extending beyond a single hiker, beyond a single day. That night, I decided to retrace my own movements since leaving the trailhead, not physically, but mentally. I examined moments where the silence had appeared unexpectedly, instances where I had paused, frozen, evaluating. I wondered whether stillness itself had become a variable, whether attention, rather than movement, was the true trigger. The following afternoon, I drove out of town to clear my head, choosing a familiar rural route that skirted the edge of managed forest land. It was not remote. There were farms, service roads, occasional traffic. I told myself this mattered. About 20 minutes in, I pulled into a small gas station to refuel. The place was quiet, a single pump operational, the attendant inside reading behind the counter. I stepped out of my vehicle and stretched, feeling the sun on my face, grounding myself in the ordinary. Then, without warning, the sound dropped out, not completely, not the total void I had experienced before. This was subtler. Ambient noise faded as if someone had lowered the volume just enough to be noticeable. The wind stilled. The distant road noise dulled. I became acutely aware of my own breathing again, too loud, too present. I did not move. The moment stretched. Nothing happened. I forced myself to walk toward the pump, breaking the stillness deliberately. The sound returned gradually, sliding back into place like a misaligned track correcting itself. The attendant never looked up. The world continued. But I was no longer able to dismiss the possibility that the phenomenon was not confined to deep wilderness, that it did not require isolation in the way I had assumed, that what mattered was context, attention, and perhaps opportunity. Over the next several days, I began noticing small inconsistencies, pauses in sound while hiking short, populated trails, moments where my peripheral vision caught shapes that resolved into nothing when focused on directly. The sensation of proximity without presence, always fleeting, always ambiguous. I did not report these incidents. Instead, I returned to Evan's log in my memory, focusing on his earliest entries. He had noted the sensation of being observed before anything overt occurred, before fear, before adaptation. I realized now that I might have crossed the same threshold, simply by reading his words, by internalizing his responses. The thought that disturbed me most was not that something had followed me out. It was that I might have brought its attention with me. On the 7th day after the recovery, I received a message from the supervisor asking me to stop by the station. No urgency. No explanation. When I arrived, he closed the office door behind me and sat heavily in his chair. He told me that during a routine audit, an older case file had been flagged by keyword overlap with Evan Miller's log. The language patterns were similar. The behavioral descriptions nearly identical. The incident had occurred years earlier, in a different region, under different circumstances. The subject had also been a solo hiker. The file included no recovered body, no confirmed cause of disappearance, only a partial log, ending abruptly during daylight hours. The supervisor did not show me the document. He summarized it instead, choosing his words carefully. He said the final entry described the forest, waiting correctly. I asked what that meant. He exhaled slowly. It means the subject believed the environment was no longer reacting. It was anticipating. I left the station with a growing certainty that whatever Evan had encountered was not bound by geography, that it did not migrate or pursue in any conventional sense. It remained where conditions allowed observation and learning to occur. And perhaps, once those conditions were met often enough, it no longer needed to stay in one place at all. That night, standing in my kitchen, I paused mid-motion while pouring a glass of water. The room felt wrong, too still, too attentive. I completed the motion deliberately, refusing to freeze, heart pounding as I listened to sound return. I understood then that avoidance was not protection. Stillness was an invitation. And whatever had watched Evan Miller had not stopped observing simply because the forest had gone quiet. By the second week, vigilance had replaced fear entirely. Fear burns hot and fast. Vigilance settles in and stays. It reshapes behavior in quiet, permanent ways. I stopped pausing mid-thought. I avoided standing still in doorways. I became deliberate about movement, even in familiar spaces, as if momentum itself were a form of insulation. I told myself this was temporary, a natural response to stress exposure, the kind of heightened awareness that fades with time. But time didn't dull it. If anything, it refined it. I began to notice patterns. The silence never arrived abruptly anymore. It eased in, gradual enough, that I only became aware of it once it was already present. It favored moments of transition, standing before opening a door, sitting alone in a parked car, pausing before speaking. The common thread was hesitation, micro moments where intention stalled. I tested this carefully, cautiously, like someone probing an injury to see where it still hurt. I would stop in a room and count seconds internally. 3. Sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes the air seemed to thicken slightly, sound dampening, just enough to make my pulse audible again. When that happened, I moved immediately. The effect always receded. Always. That consistency terrified me more than unpredictability ever could. I returned to work on limited duty, avoiding field assignments, paperwork, training modules, equipment inventory, tasks that kept me indoors, surrounded by people. It helped, but only superficially. Crowds diluted the sensation, but did not eliminate it. The presence I felt did not require isolation. It required opportunity. One afternoon, during a routine equipment inspection, I noticed something that forced me to confront a possibility I had been avoiding. A new field log template had been issued. Standardized formatting. Updated safety language. I flipped through it absently until a line near the bottom caught my attention. Note any irregular environmental responses during prolonged stillness. I stared at the sentence for a long time. That phrasing was too specific, too deliberate. I asked the coordinator where the update had come from. He shrugged and said it was part of a broader revision initiative based on accumulated field data. When I pressed further, he deflected politely, suggesting I was overanalyzing procedural language. But I wasn't. Someone had noticed the same pattern. That night, I dreamed of the forest for the first time since the recovery. Not the trail, not the ridge, just trees, evenly spaced, extending beyond visibility in every direction. There was no movement, no sound. I stood there alone, aware of being observed, yet unable to identify a source. When I woke, my bedroom was silent, too silent. I lay still for exactly half a second, before rolling onto my side and planting my feet on the floor. The normal hum of the building returned almost immediately. Pipes ticking, distant traffic, my own breath settling. I sat there until dawn, heart racing, certain that something had been waiting to see whether I would remain motionless. The next day, I requested access to older incident summaries under the pretense of comparative research. It took persistence, but eventually I was granted limited review access. I wasn't looking for explicit confirmations. I searched for language, patterns, repetition. I found more than I expected. Cases involving missing solo hikers, researchers, and rangers. Always alone, always experienced, always during daylight hours initially. Many included notes about disorientation, sound distortion, or an inexplicable sense of observation. Logs, when recovered, often ended abruptly, not in panic, but in mid-thought. The common factor was not location. It was duration. Time spent alone without interruption. Time spent stationary. Time spent observing rather than moving. Whatever this was, it did not ambush. It did not attack. It waited for conditions to align. It studied behavior across encounters, refining its understanding. The logs weren't just records. They were feedback. That realization forced a shift in how I viewed Evan's final silence. It hadn't been the end of an event. It had been the completion of a process. I stopped sleeping at home shortly after that. My apartment was too quiet at night, too predictable. I began staying with friends, keeping environments dynamic, filled with incidental noise and human movement. It helped. The sensation receded, becoming less frequent, less intense. But it never vanished. On the 12th day, I experienced something that erased any remaining doubt. I was alone in a public library, seated at a long table near closing time. A few other patrons remained, scattered and quiet. I had been reading aimlessly, lost in thought, when I realized I hadn't turned a page in several minutes. I had stopped moving. The silence crept in gently, dampening the faint sounds of shuffling papers and distant footsteps. My awareness sharpened instantly. I could feel attention settle in, precise and focused, as if something had recognized a familiar state. I did not panic. I closed the book slowly, stood up, and walked toward the exit. The silence did not follow. It lingered where I had been sitting. That detail stayed with me. The phenomenon did not attach to me personally. It attached to conditions, to states of being, to moments of hesitation and stillness that allowed observation to occur. I understood then that Evan Miller had not been chosen. He had been suitable. That night I wrote everything down, not in a formal report, in a private journal. I documented my observations, my tests, my conclusions. Not because I believed it would protect me, but because leaving a record felt necessary. If this was a process, then documentation mattered. But I made one deliberate choice Evan had not been able to. I did not write while standing still. I wrote while pacing. Because I knew now that the forest had never been the threat. The threat was the moment you stopped long enough to be understood. And whatever waits in that silence does not rush. It improves. By the third week, I had stopped pretending this was something I could simply outwait. Avoidance worked only in fragments. Constant motion was not a solution. It was a delay. I needed to understand limits, not just triggers. If stillness invited observation, then interruption might disrupt it. If patterns were being learned, then unpredictability might matter. That line of thinking came with a risk I understood too well. Testing meant exposure. I chose a controlled environment. Not the forest. Not my apartment. The ranger station after hours. The building was familiar, instrumented, predictable in layout and sound. Cameras, motion sensors, radios, people within driving distance. If something happened, it would leave traces. I arrived just after sunset. The parking lot was empty except for my vehicle. The building lights were on timers, casting long rectangles across the pavement. I unlocked the door, disabled the alarm, and stepped inside, letting it seal behind me with a heavy, final sound that echoed longer than it should have. The interior smelled of dust and recycled air. I moved deliberately, turning on additional lights, creating noise where I could. I wanted the environment active, resistant. I set up 3 audio recorders in different rooms and placed my phone on the main desk, camera facing outward. Then I waited. Not motionless. Never that. I paced. For the first hour, nothing happened. Sound behaved normally. The building settled as it always did at night. Metal contracting, distant hums cycling on and off. I began to feel foolish, the edge of my vigilance softening into fatigue. That was the moment I caught myself slowing. I stopped pacing without meaning to, attention drifting, mind slipping into that dangerous gap between intention and action. The silence did not arrive all at once. It slid in, subtle enough that my body noticed before my thoughts did. The hum faded. The building did not go quiet. It went attentive. I moved immediately, forcing my legs into motion, crossing the room, opening a drawer, knocking something to the floor on purpose. The sound snapped back into place, but not completely. A residue remained, like pressure that had not fully dissipated. I checked the recorders. They were still running. I did not stop moving again for another 40 minutes. When I finally sat down, I did so deliberately, setting a timer beforehand and keeping my foot in motion, heel tapping against the floor. I was careful to avoid full stillness, even seated. I felt ridiculous, but I did not care. That was when the hallway sensor triggered. The light outside the main office flicked on. I froze for less than a second before forcing myself to stand. The camera on my phone recorded the moment, capturing the abrupt change in lighting beyond the doorway. I approached slowly, every sense sharpened. The hallway was empty. No footsteps. No shadows resolving into shape. Just the harsh overhead light illuminating a space that should not have been activated. I checked the sensor readout. It registered movement, not continuous. Discrete. As if something had shifted position without crossing the hallway. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, that restrained attention pressing in again, closer than it had ever been indoors. The building did not feel hostile. It felt observant, like a space being used as a medium rather than a location. I backed into the office, never turning my back on the doorway, and increased the noise level deliberately. Radio static. Desk drawers opened and closed. Footsteps. The pressure eased slightly but did not vanish. I understood then that the environment itself was irrelevant. Walls did not stop it. Only interruption did. I left the station shortly after, unwilling to test further without witnesses. In the parking lot, as I locked my car, I became aware of something else. I could no longer tell whether the attention I felt was external, or learned. The idea had been forming quietly for days, but it crystallized there under the flickering lot light. Evan had adapted. I had adapted differently, but adaptation itself might be the data being gathered. Responses compared. Thresholds measured, not just by something out there, but by something that refined itself through repeated exposure. I drove home with the radio on loud, windows cracked despite the cold, refusing any lapse into silence. That night I did not sleep. I reviewed the recordings instead. The audio from the hallway recorder contained a gap. Not silence, absence. A section where ambient noise dropped below bass line in a way inconsistent with equipment failure. It lasted 6 seconds. During that time, my own movements in the office were barely audible, as if dampened by something not captured visually. The camera footage showed nothing unusual, but I noticed something else. My posture. In the moment the hallway light activated, my body had angled slightly toward the doorway before I consciously decided to move. A subtle reorientation, an instinctive adjustment, as if part of me had already known where attention would be. That disturbed me more than the sensor ever could. I realized then that Evan's final silence might not have been imposed on him. It might have been the moment his responses stopped providing new information. The next morning, I requested extended leave. Officially, it was framed as accumulated stress. Unofficially, the supervisor did not argue. He looked at me for a long moment and said only, "Stay around people." I took his advice. Crowds diluted the sensation, but did not erase it. I moved through public spaces constantly, cafes, transit hubs, places with overlapping noise and unpredictable motion. I slept in short intervals, never long enough to slip into deep stillness. It worked, mostly, until one evening in a crowded train station. I stood waiting on the platform and realized the noise around me had become irrelevant. My focus had narrowed inward, attention drifting, body momentarily still despite the chaos. For the briefest moment I felt it again. Not the forest, not the building. Attention, precise, familiar, curious. I stepped forward abruptly, breaking the moment, heart racing as sound rushed back into my awareness. People glanced at me, annoyed. Normal reactions. Normal world. But I knew then that the process Evan had encountered was not finished. It had moved past needing quiet wilderness. It had learned to wait in noise. And it was no longer confined to places where people went missing. It was confined only by moments, where people stopped long enough to be noticed. That was when I understood why the logs mattered. Why the silence came after documentation. Why the final entries always ended mid-thought. The process did not erase people. It completed them. And whatever had watched Evan Miller had not been satisfied with just one example. It was refining its understanding. And now, it had more data than ever. After that night at the station, I stopped thinking in terms of avoidance and started thinking in terms of containment. If the process could function anywhere, if it could adapt to noise and movement, then the only remaining variable was duration. Not how still someone became, but how long that stillness was allowed to persist without interruption. That realization changed everything. I stopped trying to eliminate stillness altogether. That was impossible. Humans pause. We hesitate. We drift. Instead, I focused on limiting exposure windows. I set timers on my phone at irregular intervals, vibration only, never sound. Each vibration forced a shift in posture, a step of breath taken deliberately. I slept in short cycles, alarms staggered unpredictably. I avoided meditation, avoided long conversations, drifted into silence, avoided staring at screens without moving. It was exhausting, but it worked. For a while. The problem with systems like this is that they rely on constant awareness. And awareness, by its nature, cannot be sustained indefinitely. Fatigue creates gaps. Habit creates predictability. And predictability, I had learned, was exactly what the process thrived on. The first failure happened quietly. I was on a bus, late afternoon, seated near the back. The ride was long, traffic slow, the interior filled with overlapping noise. I leaned my head against the window and closed my eyes for what I believed would be a brief rest. I did not fall asleep. I drifted. There is a difference, one I had not respected enough. Sleep is absence. Drifting is suspended attention, a dangerous middle ground. I felt it immediately, the way one sometimes realizes they are being watched in a crowded room without knowing why. The sound did not vanish. It lost relevance. The bus noise faded into a distant, flattened layer like audio heard underwater. My awareness narrowed inward. My breathing slowed. My body stilled without instruction. And something noticed, not abruptly, not aggressively, with recognition. The sensation was not external this time. There was no sense of proximity or direction. It felt internal, like a pressure aligning with my posture, my breathing, my attention, as if something had found a familiar configuration and was observing how long it would persist. I moved. Hard. I sat upright, planted my feet, shifted position, opened my eyes wide, and focused on movement outside the window. The sensation snapped. Not disappearing but loosening, like a grip release just before being noticed. I got off the bus early and walked the rest of the way, heart pounding. That was when I accepted the next truth. The process no longer required environmental silence. It required cognitive stillness. That explained everything Evan had written without ever fully articulating it. The distorted time. The sensation of being watched even while moving. The way the entity did not advance, only adjusted. It wasn't tracking location. It was tracking states of attention. The forest had simply been an efficient laboratory. I began to see the implications everywhere. People lost in thought on park benches. Drivers zoning out at red lights. Hikers pausing too long to orient themselves. The process did not take them all. It did not need to. It refined itself through select encounters, learning thresholds, optimizing timing. Most people drifted and returned without consequence. Some did not. I started to wonder whether disappearances attributed to accidents, exposure, or mental health crisis shared an unspoken commonality. Not geography, not behavior, duration, the length of time someone remained in that suspended state without interruption. That night, I opened my private journal again. Reading my own entries unsettled me. I could see the same progression I had noticed in Evan's log. Early observations, hypothesis formation, behavioral adjustments, increasing precision. I had been documenting the process while participating in it. I realized then that my journal was no longer neutral. It was feedback. I stopped writing immediately. Instead, I began recording voice notes while walking, never standing still, never pausing long enough to slip. I kept them fragmented, disorganized, refusing to let any single thought settle fully. If the process relied on clarity, on coherence, then fragmentation might reduce its value. I was wrong about one thing. Fragmentation did not reduce interest. It increased it. I began noticing longer residual effects after near incidents. Moments where the sensation lingered even after I moved. as if something was comparing the interruption to previous patterns. Evaluating response efficiency. It was learning from resistance now. That was when the supervisor contacted me again. He did not use official channels. He called from a private number and asked if we could talk somewhere public. We met at a crowded cafe near the station, noise layered and constant. He looked older than the last time I had seen him, tired in a way that went beyond work. He did not waste time. He told me that Evan Miller's log had not been archived. It had been copied, not leaked, not mishandled. Intentionally duplicated and circulated among a restricted group involved in long-term wilderness incident analysis. Behavioral scientists, environmental psychologists, risk assessment specialists, people trying to quantify the unquantifiable. I asked him why he was telling me this. Because they think documentation accelerates it, he said quietly. And because you're already involved, whether you want to be or not. He explained that earlier cases had shown a correlation between detailed logging and rapid escalation. Subjects who documented their experiences precisely tended to disappear sooner. Those who did not left fewer clues, but sometimes survived longer. Observation fed the process. Self-awareness refined it. That was why Evan's final entries were so disturbing. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood. And that understanding marked the end of his usefulness. I asked the supervisor the question I had been avoiding. Does it stop? He hesitated. Not exactly, he said. It plateaus. It reaches a point where additional data doesn't improve outcomes. That's usually when the incidents become quieter. I understood what he meant. No logs, no witnesses, no recoverable narratives. Completion. When we parted ways, he told me to destroy my journal, my recordings, anything that constituted a coherent record. He said unpredictability might still offer some protection, not safety. Delay. That night, I burned the notebook in a metal container on my balcony, tearing out pages and feeding them to the fire in small batches. I kept moving the entire time, pacing between burns, never standing long enough to watch the flames settle. As the last page curled into ash, I felt the attention sharpen. Not anger, not urgency, recognition. I realized then that by surviving this long, by adapting, by resisting documentation, I had made myself anomalous. An outlier. A data point that had not resolved cleanly. And processes like this do not ignore anomalies. They isolate them. Refine them. I did not sleep that night. I stayed in motion until dawn, aware that whatever had learned from Evan Miller had not lost interest. It had simply found a more complex subject. And complexity, I had come to understand, was exactly what it needed next. I no longer think of survival as an outcome. I think of it as an interval. The last thing I destroyed before leaving the apartment was my phone. Not because it tracked me, but because it measured me. Steps, sleep, inactivity, patterns disguised as wellness. I dropped it into a public recycling, 3 blocks away, and kept walking, choosing routes at random, turning without reason, letting the city make decisions for me. For a time, that worked. Cities are hostile to stillness. They interrupt thought with noise, motion, obligation. They fracture attention into manageable pieces. I slept on overnight trains, in cheap hotels near transit hubs, on couches belonging to friends who didn't ask questions. I learned to keep conversations shallow, movement constant, posture unsettled. I learned to let my mind skim rather than sink. The attention receded to the edge of perception. Not gone. Dormant. I knew better than to believe it had ended. Processes like this don't end. They converge. They resolve variables until only one remains. Me. The moment it finally escalated did not feel dramatic. It happened in the most ordinary place imaginable. A grocery store. Late afternoon. Bright lights. Background music. Carts rattling over tile. I was standing in an aisle comparing labels, my mind briefly focused, task-oriented. Calm. Too calm. The list in my head resolved. Decision made. Movement paused for less than a second. That was enough. The world did not go silent. It became irrelevant. The fluorescent lights flattened. The music lost meaning. The distant conversations dissolved into texture. I felt alignment occur, subtle and precise, like tumblers clicking into place. Not around me. Within me. The sensation was unmistakable now. Not observation, not proximity, but synchronization. Something matching my internal state perfectly, reducing noise until only signal remained. I understood, with absolute clarity, what Evan Miller must have felt in his final moments. This was not predation. It was optimization. I broke the moment violently, knocking items from the shelf, forcing motion, sound, disruption. People stared. Someone cursed. The spell fractured. But not cleanly. Residual pressure clung to me as I abandoned the cart and walked out into the parking lot, heart hammering. I didn't stop walking until night fell. I understood then that delay was no longer a strategy. Avoidance had plateaued. Resistance had become data. Unpredictability had been observed, measured, incorporated. The process was no longer learning how humans behaved in stillness. It was learning how they tried not to be still. There was only one variable left untested. Completion without documentation. Avon had written until he couldn't. Others had left fragments. Partial logs. Abrupt endings. I had removed my records, destroyed my notes, fragmented my thoughts. But I was still aware. Still analyzing. Still participating. The process required one final thing from me. Resolution. I went somewhere crowded enough to provide cover, but quiet enough to allow choice. A museum near closing time. High ceilings. Slow, moving patrons. Guarded exits. I moved through exhibits without reading plaques, letting information slide past without engaging. I needed a space where stillness could occur without interruption, where I could control the moment rather than stumble into it. I chose a bench in a wide gallery and sat down deliberately. I did not set a timer. I did not fidget. I did not pace. I breathed. The attention arrived immediately, not as pressure but as relief. As if a long search had ended. The world narrowed cleanly, efficiently, without resistance. I felt seen in a way that transcended direction or distance. The process did not rush. It did not need to. This was the point. I understood now what completion meant. Not disappearance. Integration. The process did not erase subjects. It refined them until variability ceased. Until response flattened into predictability. Until the subject became perfectly readable. That was when the logs ended. Not because the person was gone, but because there was nothing left to observe. I stayed seated longer than I ever had before. Minutes stretched without meaning. The attention deepened, aligning more closely with each breath, each thought. I felt memories surface, not as images but as patterns. Past pauses, moments of hesitation, all converging toward a singular, stable state. And then something unexpected happened. The process stalled, not retreated, hesitated. For the first time, I felt uncertainty ripple through the alignment, not confusion. Recalculation. I realized, too late to be afraid, that by choosing this moment deliberately, by entering stillness knowingly rather than drifting into it, I had altered the final variable. Intent. The process had optimized for unguarded stillness, for lapses, for drift. It had learned resistance, fragmentation, noise, but it had not fully accounted for surrender, not panic, not exhaustion. Acceptance. The attention tightened, probing, adjusting, attempting to resolve the discrepancy. I held the state, neither fighting nor fleeing, neither documenting nor reacting. I did nothing, and in doing nothing deliberately, I denied it the last piece of usable data. The alignment fractured, not violently, imperfectly. Sound rushed back unevenly. The gallery lights flickered as closing announcements echoed through the space. People stood, stretched, moved. The attention withdrew, not defeated but unresolved. I stood up on unsteady legs and walked out with the crowd. I am still here. That is the truth. But I am not untouched. Since that night, the sensation has not returned in full. Instead, I feel something like distance, as if the process, having encountered a state it cannot yet integrate, has set me aside. For now, I understand what that means. I am an anomaly. Unresolved data. And unresolved data is not discarded. It is revisited. I do not write this as a warning. Warnings assume control. This is simply a record. Reconstructed from memory, written in motion, never in stillness, shared not to be studied, but to be understood at a distance. If you take anything from this, let it be simple. The danger is not the forest. It is not silence. It is the moment your mind stops long enough to be perfectly read. And if you ever feel the world narrow without going quiet, if attention seems to settle in a way that feels precise rather than threatening, do not freeze. Do not document. Do not try to understand. Move. Because whatever waits in that stillness is not malicious. It is patient. And it is always looking for its next clean ending.